So there was a few questions still left over. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question from the
Sure.
How do these philosophical systems relate to the distinction between the mental affliction and a more deeper, like you mentioned in the meditation instructions, a deeper conscience or being, or I don't know how you call it, but the one who is eternal and
Right. So how do these philosophical systems relate to who we really are?
because you were talking about internal independence or dependence, and there are different levels of internal existence.
Right. So for that, that leads me into the next topic, this three vehicles chart. So we'll try and answer that question using this three vehicles chart. Because that sort of then basically brings these teachings and systems into the modern world in terms of the different Buddhist traditions. So let's have a look at that, this three vehicles chart. As I briefly mentioned, these Four Noble Truths teachings, which are the core of the Buddhist teachings, spread from India through the Pali language into Southeast Asia and into Sri Lanka. And these traditions now collectively are called the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And as I mentioned, in these Four Noble Truths teachings, the final goal of the spiritual path is nirvana. And if we achieve that goal, we're called an arhat. So first, of course, we need to develop the aspiration to strive for that goal. And that here is normally translated as renunciation. Which actually is not a very good translation, because as we see here, the original Sanskrit term is nisarana. Ni is the prefix, means out of, away from. Sarana means to move, to go. So the original term means to literally move out of, away from suffering to liberation. So nisarana is really the aspiration for liberation from suffering. That is what this is translating. So whenever we see the word renunciation, that's what we should understand, is the wish for liberation from suffering. How do we achieve that goal? We saw in the Four Noble Truths, the fourth Noble Truth, truth of the path, where this eightfold path. And we saw there that and we have them listed there, the Noble Eightfold Path, we see that they're condensed into these three higher trainings of ethics, concentration, wisdom. And the wisdom practice here, mentioned in the chart, are the three marks of existence. And specifically, the wisdom we need to achieve nirvana is this wisdom of no self. So that's the Theravada traditions, or vehicles, based on the Four Noble Truths teachings. But then, of course, we saw in these perfection of wisdom teachings, this teaching that this text is about, we have this idea of emptiness, and we have the idea of the further goal of enlightenment. And so these traditions which spread from the perfection wisdom teachings into China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and Tibet, now collectively are called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And so while the Theravada traditions are really based on the original scriptures written in Pali, the Mahayana are based on the scriptures written in Sanskrit. And of course, if we want to strive for the goal of enlightenment, we need to develop an aspiration, and that aspiration for enlightenment is called bodhicitta. It's a Sanskrit term. Chitta means mind, bodhi is enlightenment. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. It's the mind which aspires to enlightenment for the benefit of others. When we cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta, we become called a bodhisattva. Again, bodhisattva is a Sanskrit term. Again, bodhi is enlightenment. Sattva here means courage or strength. So a bodhisattva is someone who has the courage or strength to strive for enlightenment. When that bodhisattva achieves enlightenment, they become called Buddha. Buddha means fully awakened one. How do we achieve that goal of enlightenment? The practices we see here are called the 6 perfections. Mind, yeah. And of course, any of you who have studied the earlier chapters of this Shantideva text, it's all about the 6 perfections. And so chapter 9, the one we're looking at now, of course, is the 6th of those 6 perfections, the perfection of wisdom. So the preceding chapters cover the other perfections. But these 6 perfections can also be condensed into the same 3 core areas of practice of 3 higher trainings. Because here, the perfection of generosity, ethics, and patience can be condensed as ethics. Then we have concentration and wisdom. And then the 4th one, joyous effort, is something we need to apply to all 3. So also in the 6 perfections, we have the same 3 core areas of practice. But of course here the wisdom practice, the Vipassana practice, is mainly talking about this wisdom of emptiness. So this is the wisdom we need to develop on the basis of bodhicitta if we want to achieve the goal of enlightenment. But then we also have here Vajrayana or Tantra. And in Vajrayana and Tantra, what we see, of course, is we have the same goal of enlightenment, we have the same aspiration of bodhicitta, we have the same wisdom of emptiness. So what's the difference between Mahayana and Vajrayana? If we're same aspiration, same goal, same wisdom. The difference is the level of mind we are gaining access to. In Buddhism, we can talk about 3 levels of mind. And I think this is going to answer the question from here. We can talk about coarse, subtle, and very subtle levels of mind. The mind that we have now is the coarse mind. And in coarse mind, there is a whole bandwidth of levels. This would be equivalent, what is in psychology is called the psyche. So in that whole bandwidth of levels now, of the mind we have a threshold. Above that threshold, it's conscious, and below is subconscious or unconscious. Now our threshold is sort of up here, so which means we're only aware of very coarse, superficial mental activity. All the other stuff that's going on in our mind we're not aware of, which is not a good thing. Now, in the Theravada and Mahayana, when we talk about the three higher trainings, remember the basis is ethics, then we do concentration practice, shamatha practice. So what we're doing in shamatha practice is we are dropping that threshold down. The more we drop it down, the more we are aware of what's going on in our mind, the more we got a chance to work with our mind instead of being the slaves of our mind. And so when we do that concentration practice and we achieve that level of concentration called shamatha, we actually drop out of the coarse mind into the subtle level of mind. That subtle level of mind, much more powerful because it's completely calm, completely clear and focused. We use this in our wisdom practice. In Theravada for realizing no self, in Mahayana for realizing emptiness. And then with that, we move across along the path to nirvana or enlightenment, depending on what the motivation is. However, here in Tantra or Vajrayana, we're trying to gain access to this very subtle level of mind, sometimes called primordial mind, sometimes called the mind of clear light, Rikpa, given many different names. And that's what we're doing in Tantra or Vajrayana. We're trying to gain access to this, because this is even more powerful than the subtle level of mind, and use that to move along the path. To gain access to this, we have these two practices here called the two stages. We see here generation and completion stage. To be able to do these two stages practices, we need a basis. The Theravada and Mahayana are called causal vehicle. Because both of them are looking at the spiritual path from the perspective of the cause. We are here now, there's the goal of nirvana enlightenment. These are the practices I need to engage in to move along to that goal that's ahead of me. So we're looking forward from the perspective of the cause. Vajrayana or Tantra is called resultant vehicle. Because we're looking at the spiritual path from the perspective of the result. Meaning we are doing all the practices from the perspective of the enlightened state. And that's very powerful to help us achieve that goal. And sometimes this approach, or similar approach, we see sometimes used in sport. Often people imagine doing their routine, having accomplished the result, and then they do the routine, and it's a very powerful way of achieving that result. But to be able to do this, we need three things. We need renunciation, we need bodhicitta, and we need this wisdom of emptiness. Because if we don't have those three things, we don't have a basis to do it. Because here, in the first stage, we're doing generation stage practice. And that usually involves following a practice manual called a sadhana, where we do lots of visualization. We visualize ourselves in a fully enlightened form and then do lots of practices, including chanting mantra and various other things as well. But of course, to be able to do this, then we need to arise as the deity. But if we don't have particularly this, then what we will do is when we arise as the deity, say Tara, Chenrezig, Manjushri, what will probably happen is in the practice we'll go, okay, now I'm pretending to be Chenrezig. Now I'm pretending to be Tara. If that's what we're doing, we're just replacing one delusion with another. Instead of, this is me, now I'm Tara. We're grasping that as me. So then it's a complete waste of time. In fact, we could just get more delusional doing that practice. So to arise as a deity, we have to arise out of emptiness, to release the grasping. So if we don't have some experiential basis in emptiness, doing sadhana practice is really a waste of time, and it potentially just reinforces our delusions of grasping. But if we have some experience of emptiness, we arise in the deity from emptiness and do the practice, very powerful, because what it's doing, it's softening up this coarse level of mind. Down, we're moving down here. Then, in completion stage, that generally or often involves manipulating subtle energies in the body, withdrawing all subtle energies into the central channel, causing them all to come to the heart chakra, and thereby the heart chakra opens, and then the very subtle mind becomes manifest. And then if we gain access to that, we use that to realize emptiness, we can accelerate the spiritual path to enlightenment very quickly. But again, to be able to practice Tantra Vajrayana, we need emptiness and bodhicitta. To have bodhicitta, we need renunciation. So what we see here is these are sort of levels of practice. Does that mean we first need to go and find a Theravada tradition? No. Because in all the Mahayana traditions, these practices are included at the foundation level. But we need to understand these are levels of practice. So again, in the Theravada and Mahayana, we're gaining access to the subtle level of mind through shamatha practice. We're using that in the Vipassana practice of no self and emptiness to move along the path. In Tantra Vajrayana, we're gaining access to the very subtle mind through these practices, and then use that with emptiness to move along the path. So this practice, this text from Shantideva, of course, is here, coming here. So therefore what we see, this is chapter 9 we're looking at now. The first 8 chapters, of course, were dealing with the earlier of the 6 perfections. In fact, the first couple of chapters talked about bodhicitta, which bodhicitta, of course, is the entry point and support for the whole path. And then we saw the latter chapters, like particularly chapter 4 and 5, are really to do with ethics. Then chapter 6, of course, is all about patience. Chapter 7 is joyous effort, the 4th perfection, and chapter 8 is concentration. And now chapter 9 is wisdom. So we see this whole text from Shantideva is basically a practice manual on how to practice these 6 perfections, and initially, of course, how to cultivate this bodhicitta, because bodhicitta is the door of entry into this Mahayana path to enlightenment. So, of course, here now we're in chapter 9, the wisdom chapter, describing this practice of emptiness. So that's sort of the context for this text. Any last questions before we now go to the text that we're going to be following this weekend? Yeah.
Comparing emptiness to no self.
Right.
Can you posit that no self is like a subset of emptiness?
Okay. Can you posit that no self is a subset of emptiness? The answer depends on what do we mean by the word self. How the word self is described here is what's called no autonomous self. Meaning now there seems to be a me here that seems to be a little bit more than just the body and the mind. There seems to be something extra, no? We say, I have a body, I have a mind. If there's a third thing, there's 3 things here. There's me, the body and the mind. And I'm owning this body and mind. And this me definitely seems to be something a little bit more than just the body and mind. That here is grasping to self. If we realize there's no such me, this autonomous self, then we can achieve nirvana. That's what's said here. Emptiness is saying, well, okay, yeah, true, we do grasp this autonomous self, but there's something a little bit deeper going on. There's a deeper level of grasping going on. We're grasping to a inherently existent self. That's what emptiness means. So actually here, in this, what we're looking at now, emptiness and another way of using the word no self is selflessness. You can say no self or selflessness is the same. Selflessness and emptiness here is the same because self here is inherently existent self. So when we see the word selflessness here, and often you find that in texts in the Mahayana, the word selflessness is synonymous with emptiness. Here it's not. So this is like a sort of a coarser idea of self. We do have it, and we need to get rid of it, but there's something a bit deeper going on here that we need to also get rid of. So what we can say very simply is me exists. There's no Buddhist tradition that says no me. That's nihilism. But what we've done, and we'll see this a little bit more later, is we are putting something on top of what exists, the me that exists. So we're putting on top here, in this level, that there's an inherently existent self. And in here we're putting something more on top, there's an autonomous self. So there are layers of stuff we're adding. So the trick is to strip off those layers without stripping off the me. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we want to make sure we get rid of all the bathwater. And according to the Mahayana, this is only some of the bathwater.
It does not include the inherently existent self.
They here, as we're going to see, in those philosophical systems, so here we have the Vaibhashika Sautrantika following this. They say there is an inherently existent self. If it didn't, true existence in other words. If there's no truly existent self, it doesn't exist. They assert that. So they're stripping something away, but they're still holding on to something. And here, they're saying, no, you need to strip some more. You haven't done the full job yet. You're still holding on to true existence. Yes, you got rid of the autonomous self. That grasping, that's good. That'll help reduce mental afflictions. Very good. But more work needs to be done. That's what we're talking here. So we need to keep stripping and make sure we don't strip the person away as well. And that's the problem, is that this layer that we put on here is very subtle. And if we don't understand these levels of stripping, 9 times out of 10 we'll strip away the person. We'll throw the baby out with the bathwater and we'll go to nihilism. And that's very common. And even highly intelligent people do that. For example, I mentioned that Nagarjuna is the founder of this Madhyamika philosophical system from the 2nd century. And some highly intelligent modern day scholars, philosophers, who read his work say he's a nihilist. He's a nihilist. So if highly intelligent modern day philosophers look at that and say he's a nihilist, then what danger is there of us to go to nihilism? Very high, I'd say. Okay, yeah.
What about the relative truth and absolute truth?
That is the very first the topic we're going to come to. So we'll be looking at that this afternoon. It's called the Two Truths. And I'm not sure, I can't read Hebrew, but I think that in one of your first outlines, the bolded outlines, there's a presentation of two truths. Should be. Is that right? On page 2, I think, there's probably an outline that says something about the presentation of the two truths. Page 1, presentation of the two truths. So yeah, so this is the very first topic, because what we saw in those 4 philosophical systems, the Vaibhashika Sautrantika, there is an objective world there. So how things appear and reality match, no problem. Appearance and reality is the same. Appears to be in, that's the way it is, that's reality. But here, and also in Chittamatra, there's a discrepancy. How things appear and how they exist, how reality don't match. And this is the two truths. And so we're going to look at that in some detail later this afternoon. So let's go to the text then. So the text here in Sanskrit So the original Sanskrit title, remember this text is from Shantideva from the 8th century, and so it comes in Sanskrit. The Sanskrit title is Bodhisattva Charya Avatara. So Bodhisattva, of course, we saw Bodhi is enlightenment. Sattva means, here has many meanings, here means courage or strength. So Bodhisattva is someone who has the courage or strength to strive for enlightenment. And then Charya has a number of meanings. It can mean, let me get them all here. In this title here, we've translated as deeds, but also sometimes it's translated as actions, conduct. And avatara also has a number of ways of being translated. It can mean like guide, entering, and here it's translated as engaging. So therefore this Sanskrit title, you find many ways of translating into English. The one we've got here is engaging in the deeds of a bodhisattva. I think in your translation, the way of the bodhisattva. So the way, of course, is a combination of those two things. You also often see entering into the deeds of a bodhisattva, a guide to the bodhisattva's way of life. I mean, there are many ways of translating that, but this is the original title in Sanskrit. And so, of course, we're talking about a text describing the various practices of the bodhisattva, including, of course, initially how to cultivate bodhicitta and then how to practice these 6 perfections. And so that's the text that we are going to be looking at. And of course, we're looking at chapter 9. So chapter 9 is the wisdom chapter. So all the bodhicitta and the other previous 5 perfections were covered in the earlier chapters. And this chapter has, I think, 167 verses. And this year, I think, again, we want to sort of slowly move into it. And so maybe we'll get 15 verses done today and tomorrow. Maybe. Let's see how we go. Because there's no point in going through them fast. We will just get completely lost. So we'll try and do it in a very step-by-step way and really try to hold some basis so we sort of know where we are. So already I've given a little bit of background in terms of the 4 Noble Truths and so forth, and the 4 philosophical systems and so forth. And of course, you'll see they'll come very prominent in the text very shortly. And so if we go to and so you've got here, I think, the verses in English and translation into Hebrew, and then the outlines. So these outlines, of course, were not in the original Sanskrit text from Shantideva. So what you find often is that the Sanskrit texts coming from India often were written in verse form, as the case here is. So just a whole serial verses. So I think this text here is, 600-700 verses long. So if you just got 600 verses serial and you say, here you go, you'll go, well, okay, what's all that about? Because we can't see any structure. There's no... like in a lot of modern day works, we have like chapters and subheadings and so forth. Often they never really existed in Indian texts. It was just assumed you knew where you were and what the flow was, that you would already have the basis. But what we find is that in Tibetan Buddhism, they're very good at highlighting structure. So what you find, and we've got here with those outlines, is that these verses have then interdispersed in the verses, we've got these outlines which show to us the structure, show to us these verses are relating to generosity, this is to ethics, and within ethics these verses are relating to this, this and this. And so we have a whole structure there that really helps us to understand the meaning of the text. In fact, in Tibetan Buddhism, these outlines are called the sabji it's called. And what you find is that very often when the monks and nuns, when they go to study a text like this or some other text that is in verse form, the first thing they have to do is memorize the sabji. Memorize. And these outlines might be 100 or 200 outlines, but if you memorize the outline, you have a mental map of the structure, and then when you get to a particular verse, you'll know where you are in the bigger picture. So it's very helpful. Maybe you don't have to memorize that, but it's very helpful to have that structure there because it helps us to see where we are in the bigger picture. And so we have that here a little bit with these outlines. So in this text then, what we have is three main outlines for the whole text. The first outline is just covering the first verse, which is teaching that, and these outlines are coming from Drakpa Gyaltsen, who was a Tibetan master who wrote a commentary on this text, and that's the one that's often studied in the basic program in FPMT, using that text. There are a number of other commentaries, but the outlines here are coming from that commentary. And the first outline here is saying, teaching that those who desire liberation must generate the wisdom realizing suchness. So here the word suchness, I don't know what you've got in Hebrew, but this word suchness is just another word for emptiness. So there are many words you'll see in Sanskrit, because the Sanskrit word for emptiness is shunyata. And shunyata is coming from the root shunya, which actually means zero. And ta is a suffix, means sort of like what we're translating here as ness, zero-ness. But zero here, as in the understanding of hollow, meaning having no essence. No essence. So actually emptiness is a very good translation of the Sanskrit term shunyata. And suchness here is a translation of another Sanskrit term. There's another one, there's tatata, and things like that, that are synonymous with emptiness. So this is the original Sanskrit for that. So when you see the word suchness, it's just another name for emptiness. So here, the first outline is that if we want to achieve liberation, we need to realize emptiness. Then the second main outline, which covers then from verse 2 to 150, so most of the chapter 9, is how do we generate that wisdom of emptiness? How do we do that? And then the last section, which again we haven't got here of course because this is all coming later years, verses 151 to 167 is making advice on how to make effort to generate that wisdom, how to come to a direct realization of that emptiness. And so we're going to start, of course, with the first one to see that if we want to achieve liberation, then we need to generate this wisdom of emptiness. And then within from verse 2 on for this year, it's this presentation of the two truths that we're going to go into. To really, and we'll look at what the two truths are, of course, to really appreciate this idea of that there's a discrepancy with appearance and reality, that how things appear is not how they really exist. And this is all about the two truths, so that'll come. But let's just go now to the first outline, that is teaching that those who desire liberation must generate the wisdom realizing emptiness. So this is verse number 1. And so in verse number 1, it says, the Muni taught all these branches for the purpose of wisdom. Therefore, those who desire to pacify suffering should generate wisdom. Now, what I'm going to do to explain these verses is I'm going to read from a book from His Holiness Dalai Lama, who wrote a book about chapter 9 here called Practicing Wisdom. And it's an excellent book commenting on these verses, very clearly written, as always from His Holiness. Is very clear, because what you find is this commentaries that they use in the in-depth study programs, the Tibetan commentaries, can also be quite difficult to follow because they're quite detailed, whereas Holiness is always presenting his commentary in a way that is easily accessible. So that's what I want to do for every verse, is read a little bit from his book, Practicing Wisdom, and then we'll base our discussions on that, because I think you'll find it much easier to understand than if we dived into one of these more technical, detailed Tibetan commentaries. So, therefore, let's have a look at what His Holiness says about this first verse. So this is in his Practicing Wisdom, and this starts on page 17. And he says this about this first verse. He says, and now we begin with verse 1, where Shantideva states unequivocally the necessity of practicing wisdom. And then he says, in brief, all aspects of the teachings of the Buddha are intended to lead individuals to the state of full enlightenment. All teachings finally converge on this point. Because of this, either directly or indirectly, all the teachings are related to the path of generating wisdom. This is why Shantideva here says that all branches of teachings are for gaining wisdom, meaning all the other practices such as ethics, generosity, patience, and so forth, concentration, these are all the basis for leading us to this realization of emptiness. Because it's only through the direct realization of emptiness that we'll overcome the ignorance, mental afflictions, and suffering and achieve this goal of nirvana and enlightenment. And so, of course, we saw it's not here anymore on the board, that we saw that in the Theravada vehicle, they also talked about wisdom necessarily for nirvana, but in that vehicle, it's the wisdom of no self. Whereas here, it's the wisdom of emptiness. And this is based on this Madhyamika or middle way philosophical system. And that's what His Holiness here says, according to the middle way philosophy of the Mahayana tradition, in other words, Madhyamika, the realization of emptiness is indispensable even to attain liberation from samsara. This point is stated repeatedly in Shantideva's text. So therefore, even though in the other philosophical systems, the Vaibhashika Sautrantika Chittamatra, and we're not going to go into this in any detail because it's another whole topic itself, but in those philosophical systems, they say to achieve nirvana, we just need to realize this no autonomous self. In fact, they say there is an inherently existent, truly existent me. So they say that we just need to realize no autonomous self, we can achieve nirvana. But here His Holiness is saying, and what Shantideva is of course asserting, is we know we need to realize emptiness because we haven't stripped away enough. If we don't realize emptiness, if we only realize no autonomous self, we're not stripping away enough, we're not going to achieve nirvana. I mean, stripping that away is very helpful, it will be helpful, improve our life, less mental afflictions, but we won't get to nirvana. So here in the Madhyamika system, even to achieve nirvana, we need to realize emptiness, and that's what's said here. When we speak of attaining freedom from suffering, and he says here, it is crucial that our understanding of suffering is not limited to the suffering of painful sensations. Our understanding must also include the origins of such suffering, such as the mental afflictions. So that's the Four Noble Truths. So therefore, if we want to achieve liberation, we are wanting to not just get rid of painful unpleasant experiences, but they're all pervasive suffering. And the only way we're going to get rid of that is understanding that we're stuck there because of the mental afflictions, particularly our distorted view of reality, this grasping to independent me, independent world. So therefore, again, just summarizing that first verse is that all Buddhist traditions, of course, as the verse says, therefore those who desire to pacify suffering doesn't mean just unpleasant, it means pacify dukkha, means to achieve liberation, should generate wisdom. So all Buddhist traditions say that. We need to develop this wisdom to get rid of ignorance. What that wisdom is differs. Vaibhashika Sautrantika Chittamatra say wisdom of no autonomous self will get us to nirvana. In addition, the Chittamatra say this wisdom of emptiness, there's no external world, will get us to enlightenment. Madhyamika here, this is based on saying we need to realize this wisdom of emptiness to achieve both nirvana and enlightenment. We need to realize no inherently existent self, no inherent existent world. So that's what's being said here in verse 1. So what I'd like to do now is, before we go to verse 2, is have a look briefly at this view of emptiness. I mean, it's explained in much more detail later in the text, but I think because this afternoon, tomorrow, we're going to start to refute these other views, so it would be helpful if we understand a little bit what our view is, or the Madhyamika view is. So I'd like to start that now and continue that in the next session. So, again, what we're saying here is that in this text, which again is presenting the view of emptiness, as within the Madhyamika philosophical system, is that there is a discrepancy between appearance and reality. There appears to be an independent me here and an independent objective world there, but that's not how me or the world exist. So what we are doing is now we are grasping onto things existing independently. So we're talking about independent existence. And there are a number of terms used in the text to describe this. One very common term you will see is inherent existence. An inherent existence has the idea of things being self-existent, that the world is made up of many separate, discrete things, and everything has its own unique identity as that thing. So that is inherent existence. Another term that is commonly used is existing from its own side. That has the idea that things exist from their own side is that there are things existing there already and we just come along and confirm their existence. So existing from its own side means existing without the need of an observer. They exist there already from their own side. We just come along and confirm that they exist. But they're already existing there before the observer. And the term that we see here used in the text is true existence. Well, it's mainly actually used in the outlines. And true existence, the word true, for us, something is true if it doesn't deceive us. Now things appear to exist independent of us. If that's really how they exist, they would be true. Meaning the way in which they appear and the way in which they exist match. Meaning appearance and reality match. So true existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. So these are the three terms that are commonly used to describe this. There are other terms, but there are many terms used, but these are probably the three most common terms. And they're all describing the same thing, so they all have the same meaning here. They just describe the same thing from different perspectives. Inherent existence, again, has the perspective of things being self-existent, everything having its own unique nature. Existing from its own side has the perspective they exist there without the need of an observer. And true existence has the perspective they exist as they appear, the same way. So this, of course, is what we are refuting here. So emptiness is saying nothing inherently exists, nothing exists from its own side, nothing has true existence. That is what we are going to present here as the view of emptiness. Any questions about any of those terms?
So when you explained the shunyata before, you said no essence.
Yeah, no essence. So no essence, no essence probably is this perspective. No essence, no unique nature.
No inherent essence. Would you
Yeah.
try to add?
You can say that, no inherent essence. So sometimes people will use the word no intrinsic nature, no inherent essence, yeah. You can use that, you can say that, yeah.
Autonomous.
Autonomous, that's used in a little bit different way as we saw with the self. So autonomous, you could, but it could be more confusing because that's used often in another way in the text. So, but yeah, so that's shunyata probably would be more close to this perspective, the word. Okay. So what we're saying here, of course, is that the Madhyamika view, so remember this is the perfection of wisdom teachings from the Buddha that form the basis of this chapter 9 presentation of wisdom here in Shantideva. And so what the assertion, of course, here is that things are empty of inherent existence because they are dependent arising. So that's often the way it's described. And so here, this term empty of inherent existence, this is emptiness. Again in Sanskrit, shunyata. So emptiness doesn't mean things don't really exist. When we see the word emptiness, we have to ask, empty of what? What are things empty of? And we're not saying, of course, they're empty of existence. That's nihilism. What we're saying here is that things are empty of inherent existence. In other words, things are not inherently existent. They do not exist from their own side. They do not have true existence. Or very simply, things do not independently exist. Why? Because they dependently exist. So the word dependent arising here, the word arising means coming into existence. That things come into existence dependently. So that is the statement that things are empty of inherent existence because they are dependently existent. So therefore, if we can appreciate what do we mean by the fact things existing dependently, that will help better understand what we mean by emptiness. So that's what I'd like to start now and continue in the next session. What do we mean by dependent arising? That things come into existence dependently. Wait. The first way in which things come into existence dependently is they depend on causes and conditions. For example, this laptop here exists depending on causes and conditions. One of the first conditions necessary is someone needed to think about designing this laptop. And then, of course, all the raw materials needed to be gathered, they needed to be refined, all the various components needed to be manufactured, and then all the components needed to be assembled, and then, of course, all the people and factories and so forth involved in the process also necessary. So all of those causes and conditions are necessary for us to have the laptop here now. I think that's quite straightforward. But also, of course, things exist depending on their parts. Because without the metal casing, without the screen, without the keyboard, without the electronic components, without the battery, without all these parts, there would be no laptop here. So again, that's fairly straightforward, I think, that things exist depending on their parts. But what we're saying here with this statement is that because things are dependent, they're not independent. But maybe many of us in this room are happy to accept that this laptop exists depending on causes and conditions, it exists depending on parts, but at the same time happy to accept that when we walk in the door there's already a laptop existing here on the table. True? But according to this, that can't be possible, because it can't be dependent and independent at the same time. It's one or the other. Why is it that we can accept causes and conditions and parts and still accept there's a laptop existing here from its own side? Why is because we only understand causes and conditions and parts at a very superficial level. We don't understand them at the deepest level. To understand them at the deepest level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. And that is that things exist depending on labeling, designation, conception. So all those three words mean the same thing. So if you understand one of them, you understand all three. And again, often when we look at that, we'll go, yeah, I think I know what that means. That means there's a thing here and we're calling it a laptop. Again, that's quite a superficial understanding. So what's the deeper understanding? What's the deepest understanding of labeling, designation and conception? For that, we'll have to wait till after lunch because it's time for lunch break. So let's break there for lunch and come back at 2:30 and we'll go into that point, because that's really the key.